welcome to the debate. Have you ever noticed a really strange paradox in history?
Oh, there are plenty of those.
Right. But I mean specifically how the very institutions built to protect a belief system, they often end up, well, suffocating it.
Yeah, that happens a lot.
And yet the massive chaotic disasters that threaten to wipe a belief off the map entirely, those are usually the exact things that spread it the fastest. I mean, when we think about how a fire sustains itself over a long, dark night, we naturally picture a hearth.
Sure, a fireplace.
Exactly. We think of the heavy stones, deliberately placed in a circle, the careful, measured addition of fuel, and the constant, vigilant oversight required to ensure it doesn't just burn out.
Or worse, burn the whole house down.
Right. A fire that lasts is a fire that is contained, structured, and managed. Because of that architecture, it endures.
Well, but a hearth doesn't actually spread the fire, does it? I mean, it merely preserves it in a localized space. If you want a fire to reach a new forest, it usually takes a spark, jumping those carefully placed stones. It catches a wild wind, and it behaves in ways the original fire builder never planned, authorized, or, even anticipated.
That is a fair point.
It is the wild, untamed embers thrown violently out into the unknown that actually change the landscape.
And that exact tension, right? The deep, protected hearth versus the uncontrollable wildfire. That is what we are exploring today.
Yeah.
We are looking at the fundamental mechanics of how deeply held belief systems actually survive, spread, and transmit themselves across generations.
Which is a huge question.
It is. The central question we're wrestling with is this. Are faith and core values primarily sustained and expanded through structured institutional control, theological precision, and collective ritual? Or do they actually thrive through organic disruption, individual initiative, and the quiet, undeniable power of a lived example?
And to really ground this conversation, we are drawing our framework from Marie-Noëlle Thibaut's theological commentaries on biblical texts.
Right.
Specifically, we're looking at her analysis of the Acts of the Apostles, the Psalms, the first letter of Peter, and the Gospel of John, exactly as they were presented on Thierry Gelas's blog.
Yep.
And what's brilliant about these texts is that they provide a fascinating, ancient lens on a very modern sociological question, like how do ideas actually move through human populations?
And I will be arguing that the material overwhelmingly proves that enduring belief absolutely requires institutional oversight, collective memory, and a readiness for active, reasoned defense. Basically, without the stones of the hearth, the fire simply dies out in the damp grass.
And I will argue the text reveals almost the exact opposite.
Really?
Yeah, true expansion relies on decentralized disruption, individual lived experience, and an organic, viral spread of love. The fire only grows when it escapes the hearth.
Well, let's begin by looking at the absolute necessity of structure, because human history shows us that belief systems inevitably fracture and dissolve without it.
Okay, how so?
I mean, if we examine Thibaut's commentary on Psalm 65, the text makes a profound sociological argument. The collective dimension always primes over the individual experience.
So downplaying the individual?
Entirely. The text offers a profound warning against our modern obsession with individualism. If you want to transmit a worldview across generations, you just cannot rely on spontaneous individual enthusiasm.
Right.
The commentary notes that transmission requires what she calls repeated rites. We're talking about the deep rhythm of daily life here.
Yeah, the routines.
Exactly. The slow impregnation of collective memory right from childhood. The community has to repeatedly tell its founding narratives, like the story of the Exodus, in a highly structured way, or the belief literally vanishes within a generation.
It fades away.
Yeah, it's about creating an immersive environment. You don't just teach a kid a rule. You surround them with traditions until the belief becomes their default setting.
Well, I don't disagree that a default setting is comforting, but preservation is fundamentally not the same thing as growth.
While structure might offer a comforting illusion of control, it almost always leads to stagnation. I mean, the text shows us repeatedly that it is disruption, often incredibly painful disruption, that drives genuine growth.
Painful disruption like what?
Look at the profound paradox highlighted in the commentary on the Acts of the Apostles. The greatest expansion of the early belief system didn't come from a boardroom strategy session among the institutional leaders in Jerusalem.
Okay, true.
It came from an institutional disaster. It was the martyrdom of Stephen and the resulting first wave of violent persecution that shattered the protective boundaries of Jerusalem. It forced the Hellenist Jews outward into Samaria.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective.
Sure.
Even when we look at growth and innovation in the text, structure is strictly required to keep it authentic. Yes, the disciple Philip innovates by leaving Jerusalem and preaching in Samaria, but the commentary explicitly emphasizes the need for an equilibrium.
An equilibrium?
Right. The Jerusalem institution immediately sends the apostles Peter and John down to Samaria to authenticate his work. And why do they do that? The boot writes that it's so Philip wouldn't become a free electron.
A free electron?
Yeah. Without the institution tethering that individual's zeal back to a core truth, the message mutates. It splinters into a localized cult, and eventually it just dissipates.
Wait, I want to pause on that because I think we need to look closer at who is actually doing the moving here.
Okay.
You're giving the institution the credit for the expansion by focusing on Peter and John showing up afterward.
Because they validated it.
But the text explicitly points out that during this massive first persecution, the original 12 apostles, the absolute core of the institution, the founders, they stayed completely safe inside Jerusalem.
Well, yeah.
They didn't lead the charge into the unknown. It was the marginalized Hellenists.
Meaning the Greek-speaking Jews of the early movement.
Exactly. These were not the VIPs. These were the cultural outsiders within the movement who were targeted and dispersed, and they were the ones who actually did the heavy lifting of expanding the borders of the belief. The fruits of this first persecution were completely unexpected. They were totally uncontrollable by the establishment. And think about Philip's role in this. He entirely broke his institutional mandate.
How so?
Well, he was officially appointed as one of the 7, right? And his job description was purely material table service. Literally just managing the food distribution for widows.
Right, he wasn't supposed to be a theologian.
Right. Yet, he becomes a massive preacher and evangelist, dictated entirely by the immediate needs of the community he found himself in. He wasn't waiting for top-down directives from the apostles.
I suppose that's true.
Furthermore, we really need to understand the cultural context of Samaria. There was a centuries-old sociological hatred between Jerusalem and Samaria.
A massive cultural boundary.
Exactly. The institution, precisely because it was deeply orthodox and protective, would never have initiated an official mission to Samaria. It took Philip, a man of the diaspora, someone who, as the commentary beautifully puts it, does not burden himself with old quarrels.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he shattered that boundary. If you're listening to this and thinking, well, institutions always just want to control the narrative, this is a perfect example. The institution was paralyzed by its own orthodoxy. The catalyst was wild disruption, not design.
That's a fascinating framing, and I grant that the initial geographic dispersion was unplanned, but what exactly were these marginalized Hellenists dispersing when they ran?
The message.
Right, but they weren't just sharing vague, spontaneous ideas. They were carrying a very specific, unchanging core message. The commentary specifically notes that the center of all apostolic preaching is the historical reality of the resurrection of Christ.
Yes.
It argues that a preaching is only authentically Christian if it is anchored to that specific, defined event. Without that highly structured, deeply orthodox core, Philip has no message to spread. I mean, having an uncontrollable spark is useless if the spark isn't actually made of fire.
Having a core message doesn't mean you need a centralized institution to micromanage how it spreads, though.
But you absolutely need an institution to verify it. Think about the mechanics of how a scientific breakthrough works.
Okay.
You might have an individual brilliant researcher working out in a garage somewhere on the fringes. They might make an accidental, completely unplanned discovery.
Just like Philip finding this incredibly receptive audience in Samaria.
Exactly. Before that raw discovery to become accepted science, To actually integrate into the body of knowledge, it requires the established scientific community to peer review it, to validate the methodology.
I see where you're going.
That is exactly the sociological function of Peter and John being dispatched from Jerusalem. They aren't sent to squash Philip's work or put him in chains. They are sent to authenticate it. They lay hands on the Samaritans so they receive the Holy Spirit. They integrate this wild new data point back into the main body, ensuring the core truth remains intact. You need the innovation, sure, but without institutional authentication, you just have rogue data.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that parallel.
Oh, why not?
Let me tell you why. You are comparing this explosive, life-or-death cultural crossover to a sterile, orderly academic peer review process.
It's an analogy.
But the text emphasizes the messy, radical, boundary-breaking nature of what happened. Peter and John validating it after the fact is just the institution playing catch-up to the organic spread of belief.
Catch-up?
Yeah. If the movement had waited for Jerusalem's peer review before taking action, the message would have stayed locked within the walls of Jerusalem forever.
Well, but that raises a massive question. Let's assume the spark gets out into the wild, past the stones of the hearth. Once a belief system is out there engaging with the broader culture, the wind isn't always friendly.
Oh, definitely not.
It inevitably faces intense cultural friction. So how does this belief system actually defend itself when the surrounding culture pushes back?
Okay.
This brings me to the commentary on the first letter of Peter, specifically chapter 3, verse 15. The text issues a very explicit command to believers to be ready at any moment to present a defense and to render reason for their hope.
It does say that, yes.
And we can't gloss over the mechanics of that phrase. Rendering reason and presenting a defense. I mean, that implies a highly structured intellectual readiness.
Does it?
Yes. It requires an active, articulate stance against a hostile world. Thabit's commentary notes that these early believers were facing latent hostility, daily vexations, and calumnies from the pagan culture around them.
Right.
You cannot just stumble blindly through that kind of cultural opposition, relying on good vibes. You have to have a reasoned, coherent argument prepared. You have to be able to intellectually justify your worldview to a skeptic. And doing that requires education, it requires a unified theology, it requires the very institutional hearth you are downplaying.
That is a very compelling institutional argument. But have you considered the exact interpretation Thabit provides for that very verse?
Which part?
While she cautions us heavily against reading present defense as a call for aggressive intellectual debate or sophisticated apologetics.
But she uses the word defense.
She does. But in fact, she provides a crucial quote to completely reorient our understanding of this defense. She says, "Speak only if you are interrogated, but live in a way that you are interrogated." Think about the mechanics of that. The defense being advocated here isn't rhetorical. It is entirely behavioral.
But behavior without explanation is just being polite. I mean, it doesn't transmit the specific mechanics of a belief.
It provokes the question. And as any good communicator knows, the only time an explanation is actually heard and absorbed is when the audience is the one asking the question.
Okay, fair point.
You aren't supposed to go out and argue people into submission with a perfectly crafted theological syllabus. You are supposed to live such a radically different, hope-filled life that people can't help but stop you and ask, why do you live that way?
Right.
The commentary cites Pope Paul VI here, noting that our contemporaries need witnesses, not masters. And it adds a crucial caveat. People only listen to masters if they are first witnesses. If the transmission of belief was merely about rendering intellectual reason, it would just be an academic exercise.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because I think you are skipping over the prerequisite for that kind of radical life.
What prerequisite?
Look at the very first part of Peter's instruction in that exact same passage. Honoreis dans vos cœurs la sainteté du Seigneur. Honor in your hearts the holiness of the Lord.
Okay.
The internal architecture, the deep theological grounding, absolutely must precede the outward action. You cannot live a life that provokes profound questions if you don't possess a rigorously defined core belief to anchor you when things get difficult.
Look, I am not arguing against having a core belief. I am arguing against the idea that the institution's primary job is to create an army of highly trained intellectual debaters to fight the culture war.
But when the questions do come, the text literally commands them to render reason. It doesn't say just smile or offer a vague platitude about love. You have to explain the underlying logic of your hope.
Yeah, but
Furthermore, the commentary highlights the necessity of having a right conscience so that your adversaries are taken by shame on the very point where they speak ill of you.
right.
Think about the sheer intellectual and moral rigor required to render reason in a way that actually dismantles a calumny without resorting to anger. That level of readiness doesn't just sprout up organically out of nowhere. It is the direct result of systematic collective preparation.
But the power doesn't lie in the systematic preparation. The power lies in the quiet, undeniable testimony of the individual's lived reality in the moment of friction. Dabaut points out that the defense of these early Christians was profoundly simple, refusing to lower their arms before malice and refusing to participate in the hatred of the pagan culture around them.
Sure.
That is an individual choice made in the crucible of daily life. It is not an institutional mandate you can force on someone.
Yet we have to ask ourselves, how does an individual learn to make that impossible choice? A person doesn't just wake up one random Tuesday and decide to endure cultural persecution with perfect grace and intellectual clarity.
No, they don't.
They don't generate that resilience in a vacuum. And this brings me right back to the commentary on Psalm 65, which I think provides the foundational sociological mechanism for how human beings actually work.
You're talking about the transmission of collective memory.
Exactly. How do you build that behavioral defense you're talking about? The Munaput offers a profound insight here. In the biblical universe, the individual doesn't invent their faith from scratch. They inherit it. An individual child learns the stories of the Hot-Fate, the great founding deeds of God, through the rhythm of daily life. The daily prayers from morning to evening, the seasonal festivals, the physical pilgrimages.
The repeated rites again.
Yes. The family and the broader community provide a totally immersive, structured environment. Without the hearth rigorously repeating these rites, the memory fades and the belief dies.
Well,
You cannot sustain the kind of worldview required to endure persecution on purely individual spontaneous enthusiasm. The mechanism of deep, lasting change is fundamentally collective and ritualistic. If you want the individual to be strong enough to face the wildfire of the world, you have to build them inside the hearth first.
I come at it from a different way.
Okay.
I agree that collective memory has value as a starting point, but if we look at the commentary on the Gospel of John, specifically chapter 14, it fundamentally shifts the locus of where true transformation happens.
How so?
The ultimate promise of the new covenant in this text isn't a better building, a tighter community, or a more rigorous schedule of collective rituals.
Well, it is the fulfillment of all those rituals, though.
It's the internalizing of them, to the point where the external structure becomes almost secondary. The commentary points back to the prophets Ezekiel and Joel, who dreamed of a future time when the Spirit wouldn't be confined to a physical temple or restricted to a specific nation.
Right. Poured out on all flesh.
Exactly. Jesus tells his disciples that the Spirit of truth will be in you. Il sera en vous. The institution, the physical temple, the repeated external rites, they are ultimately superseded by the internal, uncontrollable reality of the individual heart.
That is a beautiful theological concept. I grant you that. But look at the text's own warning in that very same passage in John.
Which warning?
It explicitly states that the world cannot receive this Spirit because it doesn't see it or know it. Therefore, there absolutely must be a visible collective body, an institution, a structured community to make that invisible Spirit known to the world. You cannot have a purely internalized, invisible belief system. It has to manifest in an organized, tangible way to effectively engage with what the text calls the spirit of the world.
But how does it engage? That is the critical mechanism, and it is exactly where your top-down institutional model breaks down.
Break it down for me.
The commentary on John explicitly defines the mission not as a coordinated conquest by an organized, unified army, but as an evangelization by contamination. Think about the mechanics of a viral contagion for a second.
Okay.
It completely bypasses institutional mechanics.
Framing it as a contagion sounds almost accidental, though, like it lacks intention.
It's not accidental. It's organic. It's a quiet, person-to-person spread. Think about how a viral trend or a new idea sweeps through modern culture.
Sure.
A virus doesn't spread because a committee sat in a boardroom and passed a resolution, or because a liturgy was performed with perfect theological precision. It spreads through simple proximity. It spreads through contact.
Thubbett writes that the goal is to spread the spirit of love over the spirit of the world, simply from neighbor to neighbor. It is the most decentralized, uncontrollable process imaginable.
Wow.
The institution might try to build the walls, but it's the quiet, viral contamination of lived love by individuals that actually sneaks past the defenses and transforms the culture.
Well, we are nearing the end of our time, so let's summarize where we stand on the mechanics of this incredibly rich material.
Sounds good?
I maintain that while individual zeal, organic spread, and lived experience are certainly valuable parts of the equation, the text continually demonstrates that a lasting truth requires a firm structural anchor.
Right.
If we look at the necessary equilibrium provided by the apostles Peter and John, acting as a peer review to authenticate the rogue work in Samaria, or the rigorous intellectual readiness commanded in the letter of Peter to render reason against a hostile culture, all the way to the essential immersive environment of repeated rites and collective memory outlined in the Psalms. Time and again, the text shows us that belief systems require theological precision, structural oversight, and institutional unity to survive the immense friction of passing from one generation to the next.
And I would summarize that the text's most powerful, paradigm-shifting moments show belief thriving precisely outside the bounds of that carefully managed institutional authority.
Okay.
Whether we are looking at the disruptive, explosive expansion sparked not by a plan, but by the disaster of Stephen's persecution, or Philip's completely unscripted adaptation to the immediate, messy needs in front of him in Samaria,
Yeah?
or the quiet, undeniable viral contamination of a lived example as described in John. True growth relies on individual initiative and organic spread. Structure preserves the embers, yes, but it is disruption and individual witness that actually breathe life into the world and start the fire.
However, I will acknowledge a significant and honestly a beautiful point of convergence in our reading of the material today.
Oh, what's that?
Regardless of the exact mechanism of transmission, whether we favor the highly structured institutional apologetic or the organic individual viral witness, the text is completely, undeniably explicit about the required posture.
Yes, absolutely.
When engaging the outside world, it must always be rooted in what Peter calls douceur et respect, gentleness and respect. Both the structured intellectual defense and the organic lived witness fail entirely if they adopt the hostility, the aggression, or the malice of the very world they are trying to engage.
Absolutely. That is a brilliant point to land on. Thabut reminds us that the ultimate model given in the text is the servant from Isaiah who will not cry out, nor raise his voice.
Right.
The engagement with the outside world is meant to be profound. It is meant to be deeply challenging to the cultural status quo. But it is never meant to be forceful, aggressive, or coercive. It is a quiet revolution.
Which brings us right back to the imagery we started with, the hearth and the wildfire. There is an enduring, perhaps completely unresolvable tension between the necessity of roots, the deep, protected, systematic structure of the institution, and the necessity of reaching out, the wild, unpredictable, boundary-breaking spark of the individual.
And these commentaries offer such a profound, ongoing exploration of how human beings actually share their deepest convictions with one another. I mean, as we look at how ideas move to the world today, we continually have to ask ourselves, is it the carefully built stone circle that truly keeps the fire alive in the dark? Or is it the ember carried recklessly on the wind that ensures it never truly dies?
We will leave you to weigh the evidence, examine the mechanisms for yourself, and consider that question.